Soho, London. It's late August 1854.
And this isn't just a story about data, it's a story about how a map managed to defeat a certainty that was, what, centuries old?
It really was.
Yeah.
The city is dense, it's incredibly wealthy, but it's also, frankly, choking on its own success.
Mm.
And the price for all that density arrives in the form of just a catastrophic cholera outbreak.
And catastrophic really is the right word. Cholera is. It's brutal. The symptoms are violent, they're fast. People could be dead within hours from just extreme dehydration.
It acted like a public verdict. Swift, terrifying, and seemingly random.
So for generations, the intellectual framework for disease, the accepted science, was the miasma theory.
Right, and we have to be clear, the sources really emphasize this. This wasn't some, superstitious belief from the Dark Ages.
No, not at all. This was a scientifically supported framework. It went all the way back to Galen. The theory was that disease traveled via miasma.
This noxious, poisonous vapor, bad air that rises up from, decomposing organic matter, sewage, refuse, all of it.
And here's the crucial part. The reason the miasma theory was so incredibly sticky, it was just so emotionally and sensorially satisfying.
It was. London in 1854 stank. The air was thick with pollution, with sewage, with smoke. If you walked down the street, your own senses confirmed the theory for you.
It felt intuitive. Bad smell, bad air must equal bad disease. The environment itself seemed to be testifying against itself, pointing to the source of the poison.
But in the middle of all this terror and all this sensory proof, there's one physician, John Snow, who's watching his city just collapse. And he feels that story, that satisfying explanation, start to wobble.
He'd already been arguing, right? Even before this specific outbreak, that cholera traveled through contaminated water, not through the air.
He was, which put him completely at odds with the intellectual weight of his entire generation. I mean, challenging miasma back then was sort of like trying to deny gravity.
And he had a huge problem. He didn't have the final proof. Lab confirmation, bacteriological evidence, that was all still decades away. He couldn't just put the pathogen under a microscope and show it to people.
So what do? If you can't use the lab data, how do you challenge a belief that literally everyone knew was true?
You use patterns. And this is where Snow's method becomes so revolutionary. It's August 31st, 1854. The Soho outbreak is surging. People are dying daily.
And Snow starts doing something that these certainty systems absolutely hate. He just stops theorizing.
And he starts counting?
He starts counting. He starts logging data points, and he starts mapping their spatial distribution. He's literally walking the streets, getting the addresses of every single person who died.
He's treating the deaths not as these random tragic acts of God or fate, but as data points that are tied to a physical system.
And he plots them meticulously on a local map of Soho.
The result must have been just stunning. You can almost picture it. The little marks on the map start to thicken, they start to concentrate almost exclusively around one single specific point.
The public water pump on Broad Street, which is now Broadwick Street.
And that visual clustering, it wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't a vague suggestion. It was direct, it was spatial, and it was accusatory data. He had, in effect, localized the miasma. He'd given the fog an address.
But the real power of his work, the moment this hypothesis really snaps into perfect focus, comes from the exceptions.
The negative evidence.
Exactly, the power of negative evidence. If the air itself was the poison, then why were certain buildings right in the middle of the blast radius relatively spared?
Why are there these little pockets of safety surrounded by a sea of death? That's the question that unravels the whole miasma theory.
It is. Snow investigates a large nearby workhouse. It's got about 500 residents. Geographically, it is completely surrounded by these clusters of deaths. By the miasma logic, it should have been devastating.
Oh, it wasn't. It had, what, only 5 deaths from cholera?
Only 5, and here's the critical clarifying detail that changes everything. The workhouse had its own well. It had its own separate water supply.
You weren't using the Broad Street pump.
They weren't using the pump. And that single exception is a massive data point. It proves that just being near the bad air was totally irrelevant. The variable that mattered was access to the pump water.
And there was a brewery, too, wasn't there?
Yes, a local brewery. The workers there famously drank beer as part of their daily wages. And the brewery also had its own private well for, cooking and brewing.
And they had far fewer cases.
Far fewer. The exceptions weren't these annoying anomalies to be ignored. They were the defining parameters. They proved the cause wasn't something that everyone was breathing.
It was something that only some people were swallowing. The contaminated water, probably from an old sewer line leaking into the pump's well.
And that observational clarity, That's what gave Snow the authority to act. He had the map. So within just 2 days of starting it, he goes to the parish authorities.
Which must have been a difficult conversation. These officials were deeply invested professionally and intellectually in the miasma theory.
A huge political act. But he shows them the map, he shows them the pattern, and he urges them to disable the pump. Just physically remove the handle.
And amazingly, they do it.
They do. Now, our sources are careful here. The outbreak was probably already past its peak by then, so removing the handle might not have single-handedly stopped the epidemic.
Yeah.
But that's almost beside the point.
The hinge moment, the real lesson, is that community leaders chose to act immediately against the prevailing, intuitive, emotionally satisfying belief.
Based purely on a pattern derived from observable data, not from medical tradition or common sense.
The principle we can pull from this is, it's so profound and it runs completely counter to our normal human nature.
It does. When a belief feels obvious, when it fits perfectly into a story that feels right in your gut, that's the moment you have to stop debating it.
And start mapping it.
Start mapping it. Our default is narrative first thinking. Snow didn't ask what's the dominant story here. He asked, where is the problem concentrated? And, just as importantly, where is it absent and why?
And this method, it scales down perfectly to the personal level. We all have what you could call miasma beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. They're those vague, atmospheric, almost spiritual declarations we make about ourselves that hold us back.
I'm bad at mornings. I always fail at being consistent.
The market's too volatile for me to invest, or I'm just not someone who can negotiate. These feelings, they feel like the fog in London. They feel like fate.
But Snow's approach forces us to replace that fog with a map. You have to operationalize the vague belief. You have to turn it into objective, falsifiable data points.
Because the second you start logging the specific days you were consistent or the times you did negotiate well, even a little, you prove something vital.
Which is?
That the story isn't a law of physics. It's just an unverified hypothesis.
Right.
And those exceptions, they are your instruction manual for how to live differently.
Okay, so let's make this really practical. Let's translate this into some tools for you, for anyone listening. First, literally make a belief map.
Yes. Write the vague, limiting belief right at the top of a page. Let's say, I always lose focus after lunch.
Okay.
Then underneath it, you list the last 10 real instances of this failure. The date, the place, the context. What was I working on? Who was I talking to? What did I eat? Patterns only emerge when you stop just summarizing the failure and you start logging the components.
Second tool.
Yeah.
You have to hunt the exceptions like a detective. You have to actively ask yourself, when is this belief less true? Or when did I actually defy this pattern?
Because those exceptions, they're not just random luck. They contain a protective variable. What was it? Was I in a different location? Did I have someone holding me accountable?
Okay, and the third one, this is maybe the most powerful tool in this whole part of our deep dive.
I think it is. Swap moral language for measurable variables. This is the key to moving from shame to a solution.
So stop calling yourself lazy or a procrastinator.
Exactly. Replace that moralistic shaming word with objective, testable conditions. Slept less than 6 hours. The next step was unclear. I had no social accountability for the outcome, or the task felt too big to even start.
The moment you turn a moral judgment like lazy into a variable like slept less than 6 hours.
You can treat it like Jon Snow treated the pump. You can measure it, you can test it, and you can change it.
So here's the challenge for today. Pick one belief that feels like it's just the way I am. Log 5 recent data points, focusing hard on the context, where, who, what time, your emotional state.
And then find and circle the single most significant exception. The one time it didn't happen. And for 1 week, just run an experiment where you try to copy the variables from that exception.
Because if your most restrictive self-belief can't actually survive a data map, it really doesn't deserve to control your future.
That pivot from an abstract certainty to, tangible data is so fundamental for these physical or operational beliefs. But what about beliefs that aren't tied to physical data? What about beliefs tied to identity, to hatred, to really deep-seated prejudice?
Right, because those are often defended even more fiercely. The belief is the armor.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears. We're moving from mapping cholera in London to trying to map the geography of hatred. And this is a story that requires this relentless, almost unbelievable level of curiosity.
We're focusing on Daryl Davis. He's a black musician, and this is about his decades of persistent dialogue with members of the Ku Klux Klan.
This all starts kind of unexpectedly in Frederick, Maryland, back in 1983.
Right. Davis walks into the Silver Dollar Lounge, which is a known all-white bar, to play a piano gig. He's just there to work. He's blending his professional talent with a really unusual environment.
And his music is so good that for a little while it just dissolves the racial tension in the room.
After his set, a white man comes up to him. He's super complimentary, but the compliment itself is racially loaded. He tells Davis he's the first black man he's ever seen play piano like Jerry Lee Lewis.
And then comes the reveal. Just casually, like he's talking about the weather, the man says he's a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
I mean, most people, and rightly so, would have just ended that conversation right there. Maybe with a confrontation, or maybe you just walk away.
Of course.
But Davis was driven by this really fundamental question about the mechanics of prejudice. How did this kind of hatred survive when the actual target is standing right in front of you?
So he doesn't respond with rhetoric. He doesn't attack. He responds with a question. And this question basically becomes the spine of his life's work. He asks, how can you hate me when you don't even know me?
And that question, it's such a powerful, non-aggressive disruption because it forces the believer to confront the crack between their abstract prejudice and the immediate human reality of the person standing right there.
It's challenging the belief system at its very foundation, which is ignorance.
Right. And the sources on this really emphasize that this kind of prejudice is often built on what you could call secondhand certainty.
Secondhand certainty. What do you mean by that?
It's constructed from stories you've inherited. Myths that get repeated so many times they start to feel like your own personal experience. And it's held in place by constant group reinforcement that gives you a sense of belonging and a sense of moral superiority.
So when you attack that armor with facts or with moral condemnation, you often just make it stronger.
You do. The nervous system just interprets that attack as an existential threat to your identity, and it digs in even deeper.
But Davis shows curiosity and sustained contact over that kind of confrontation. He seemed to understand that you can't fact-check someone out of an identity they're actively defending.
But you can interrupt that identity. You can interrupt it by introducing a persistent relationship that provides this relentless, lived contradiction. So he kept talking to the man, and the man kept coming back to the bar.
And that sustained dissonance, that act of just keeping the channel open, that's what eventually allowed Davis to get access to other KKK members.
It led to years of first-person interviews, real relationships, which he documented in his book, Clandestine Relationships.
Okay, but we have to introduce some friction here, because isn't there a risk that by constantly engaging, you're normalizing or even enabling this hateful ideology?
That is the essential distinction. And it speaks to the incredibly high emotional and ethical cost of using this method. Davis was very clear about this.
How so?
He was never challenging the person's right to believe what they believed, at least not in his presence. He was challenging the belief's integrity just by the simple fact of his presence and the sustained contradiction of their interaction.
So he never surrendered his own dignity. He never pretended the truth of his own experience wasn't real?
Never. He just refused to allow the Klansman's belief system to deny him his humanity to his face.
So he wasn't arguing, you're wrong because of history or you're a bad person. He was effectively arguing, your system has a fatal flaw because the person you claim to hate is making music you love and is willing to sit here and talk with you without venom.
Exactly. And that process, over time, it creates an enormous amount of internal cognitive load for the believer. The dissonance becomes too much.
And the result of all this is, it's genuinely remarkable.
It is. Through decades of this sustained, non-judgmental, but absolutely non-compliant dialogue, Davis helped persuade over 200 Klan members to leave the organization.
And they would literally hand him their robes.
They'd hand him their white robes and their hoods, these physical, undeniable symbols of their renunciation. The change wasn't because of one dramatic, eloquent showdown.
No, it came from the slow, deliberate, painful decision to just keep the conversation alive long enough for reality to accumulate and make the old belief too structurally expensive to keep maintaining.
And that principle is so profound. It works across every domain, not just in cases of radical prejudice. Beliefs don't only change through proof, they change through sustained contact with contradiction.
The nervous system has to have repeated exposure to the counter-evidence. It has to happen until that old self-defense mechanism, the belief, is finally seen as obsolete.
And this applies so powerfully to our internal beliefs. Your brain is a fierce defender of the status quo, and it will aggressively defend your negative self-beliefs.
Things like, I'm unlovable, or I'm an incompetent public speaker.
Yes, even when there's evidence to the contrary. Because those beliefs, they act like identity badges that protect you from taking a risk.
So to update that internal system, you have to deliberately manufacture what you could call contact reps.
Contact reps, I like that.
Oh,
Repeated, small exposures to the counter evidence. Maybe that's consistent coaching or a really honest accountability conversation, or just forcing yourself into a new environment where the old identity template doesn't fit anymore.
you have to keep that human bridge open long enough for the new truth to actually be internalized.
Okay, let's translate this into some tools for the listener. First, when you're confronting a difficult belief, whether it's your own or someone else's, you have to lead with a disarming question that's focused on exposure, not on attack.
So instead of, how can you be so wrong?
Right. Instead of that, you try. What experience was it that truly convinced you of that? Or what purpose does holding on to that belief serve for you? It shifts the focus away from moral judgment and towards gathering data on the belief's architecture.
Okay, second tool. Separate the person from the belief. When you're listening, you are not endorsing their view. You are gathering data on the scaffolding that holds up that identity.
Think of it like a deep interview. The goal is information extraction, not immediate conversion.
And third, and this is so crucial for the internal work we all have to do, name the identity payoff.
Yes. You have to ask yourself, honestly, what does this belief actually protect me from? For example, the belief, I'm bad at starting businesses, might be protecting you from the risk of a spectacular public failure.
And the belief, people won't support me if I ask, might be protecting you from the shame of asking for help and getting rejected.
Exactly. Beliefs often function as shields against responsibility or shame or pain. When you can identify that protective purpose, you can start to replace the old shield with a new, more constructive mechanism.
So here's the action for today. Pick one internal belief that keeps you feeling stuck. An old story your brain uses as a shield.
Then write down one honest, non-attacking question that challenges its foundation. Something like, what evidence would I need to see to believe the exact opposite of this?
Then commit to a 2-week contact plan. Just 3 small, measurable exposures to that counter evidence.
Because if you want a new truth to really take root, you don't win a single big argument. You have to build enough sustained, contradictory contact with reality until the old protective story it runs out of air.
Okay, we've established that data can defeat intuition, and sustained contact can penetrate identity-based hatred. So now let's shift gears again and move from the psychological battlefield to the high-stakes, ruthless corporate strategy room.
This is where identity meets market economics. And the cost of holding on to an outdated belief isn't just psychological. It can be measured in billions of dollars.
We're talking about Intel in the mid-1980s. This company was, they were the American pioneer of the semiconductor industry. Their entire legacy was built on innovation.
And their core business, the thing that made them who they were, was facing an existential threat. And that threat was focused on DRAM dynamic random access memory.
To really get the crisis, you have to understand what DRAM meant to Intel. It was their foundation. It's the product that stores working data in computers. Intel was literally founded on memory chips.
By the early 80s, they had mastered the manufacturing process. It was their main technology driver. It was their identity.
But the global landscape had completely structurally changed. Fierce, relentless competition, especially from Japanese firms like NEC and Hitachi, was just destroying their margins and their market share.
And these Japanese companies were brilliant at manufacturing at scale and with incredible efficiency. They could produce high-quality DRAM faster, cheaper, and with better yield rates than Intel could even dream of.
So this wasn't just a tough quarter for Intel. This was a fundamental shift that was making their primary business model obsolete.
And yet, internally, the beliefs around DRAM had hardened into these sacred truths that made the idea of abandoning it feel like absolute heresy.
The beliefs were really potent. Things like, memory is our technology driver. The idea that it forced them to maintain manufacturing excellence.
Right, or our customers need us to be a full-line semiconductor supplier, and then the most dangerous one of all.
This is who we are.
That's the one. The financial facts were screaming for a change. Intel was bleeding cash in the DRAM business. But the deep-seated corporate narrative, their story about themselves, was aggressively resisting.
And that identity inertia, that's the real danger zone. The sources we looked at highlight this incredible tension felt by the CEO, Andy Grove, and the co-founder, Gordon Moore, in late '84, early '85.
They're looking at these dire numbers. They know that every attempt they've made to beat the competition at their own game is failing. And Grove realizes he needs some kind of profound psychological jailbreak to get past this shared institutional identity.
And he finds it. He finds it by asking one of the most famous and devastatingly effective questions in the history of business strategy.
We call it the outsider question. He turns to Gordon Moore and he asks him, verbatim, if we got kicked out and the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do?
That question is just brilliant. It's brilliant because it immediately strips away every single emotional, sentimental, and sunk cost distortion that was paralyzing their decision-making.
It demands pure, unromantic objectivity. It forces you to look at the problem as if for the first time.
And Moore's answer was instantaneous. It was blunt. It was undeniable.
He said the new CEO would, without any hesitation, get Intel out of the memory business.
And the silence after that, according to the sources, was just heavy with the recognition of this obvious truth they had been actively avoiding for months, maybe years.
But Grove, crucially, seizes that moment. He doesn't just let the truth hang in the air like an accusation. He follows up with the action hinge. He says, why shouldn't you and I walk out that door, come back in, and do it ourselves?
And that wasn't just agreement. That was a commitment to execute on the updated belief.
That choice led directly to Intel, withdrawing completely from DRAM. They sold off their last memory-related facilities, and they focused their entire strategic might on microprocessors.
The very technology that would power the PC revolution. I mean, this move, forced by an external perspective, it literally saved the company and became the central strategic shift of the next 2 decades.
So the principle here is just critical for anyone who manages complexity, whether it's a company or just your own career. And it is this: your most expensive beliefs are the ones that used to be true.
Oh, that's good. You cling to the past success, you label it core identity, when in reality it's become a liability.
And Grove's outsider question is like an identity-challenging machine because it strips away 3 really powerful psychological distortions that prevent change. We should probably define them.
Let's do it. The first is status distortion.
Right. As CEO, Grove had built his career defending and refining their memory manufacturing. The belief that DRAM is essential validated his entire past success.
The outsider question forces you to abandon that defense of your own legacy and just adopt a neutral, competency-focused stance. What works now?
The second is sunk cost distortion. Intel had poured decades of R&D, billions of dollars, the careers of thousands of engineers into DRAM. It is incredibly painful to admit that investment is gone.
The sunk cost fallacy forces you to keep defending the investment, hoping for a return, rather than just facing the current reality.
But the outsider, the new CEO, they don't have that investment to protect. They have no emotional baggage.
And the third one is story distortion.
Yes. The narrative, this is who we are, was trumping the hard facts of the market. They were letting nostalgia win over necessary adaptation.
The outsider question forces an answer based on what the market rewards now, not what created success 10 years ago. It replaces the question, what do we want to be true, with the much sharper, what would a competent, unromantic leader do with the current facts, assuming zero history?
And this framework, it scales directly to your own individual career or your personal life. If you were hired today to run your own career like it was a business, what would a new CEO immediately stop doing?
What routines, what client relationships, what skills that once protected you are now just holding you back through the sheer inertia of identity?
So the listener tools for this section are all focused on this idea of a strategic detox. First, use the outsider question verbatim on your most expensive, entrenched professional belief.
Write down the belief. For example, I have to stay in this industry because of my degree. Then write down the new CEO's answer and do it fast. No editing, no defending.
Second tool, separate core from history. Be ruthless. Define what specific actions or processes still create a true measurable advantage for you right now. That's your core.
Everything else is history. It's what only creates nostalgia or internal comfort or institutional fatigue.
Third, run a sunk cost detox. For any current major commitment, a long project, an old client, a dysfunctional routine, you have to ask, if we weren't already doing this, would we start it today?
And if the clear answer is no, then you're just buying emotional comfort. You're not buying strategic advantage. That commitment needs to be revised or terminated.
So the action hinge for today is this. Identify one expensive belief you run your work by. Ask the outsider question and write down the answer. Then enact one walk out and walk back in action within the next 48 hours.
Stop one inefficient meeting. Drop one legacy feature from a project. Reassign 1 hour of your day to the new non-historical priority. Because when the market facts fundamentally change, you should never protect your identity. You have to replace it with a more efficient operating system. All right, we've covered data, dialogue, and strategy. Now let's pivot to the world of performance, where physical execution comes face to face with inherited wisdom.
And we're going to look at two iconic examples from sports that show how external constraints and measurable outcomes can force beliefs to update, no matter how ridiculous the new solution might look at first.
Our first stop is the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. We're at the men's high jump competition.
For decades, the goal of the high jump clearing a horizontal bar was pursued using these very established techniques. The standard was some variation of the straddle or the Western roll,
Where the athlete goes over the bar, stomach down, facing it, and uses this really complicated rotation to get over while trying to keep their center of gravity below the bar.
And these techniques, they looked disciplined, they looked appropriate. But there was a crucial physical reason for them, and that reason was the landing.
In the earlier decades, high jumpers were landing in pits of sand or sawdust.
Exactly. So you had to clear the bar in a way that ensured you landed on your feet or on your side to protect your head and your neck. The technique was an absolute physical necessity dictated by the landing surface.
The belief was, this is the only viable way to achieve height without getting seriously injured.
But then the environment changed. By 1968, they had introduced these thick, synthetic foam landing mats. And this change at first wasn't about performance, but it fundamentally altered the physical constraint.
Suddenly, landing on your back was survivable.
And now, enter Dick Fosbury, a 21-year-old American. His run-up is this smooth, curved arc, which is already pretty unorthodox. And then, at the moment of takeoff, he turns his back to the bar, arches his body over, and goes back first across the bar.
Landing on his neck and shoulders in the soft foam, it was called the Fosbury flop.
And it looked ridiculous. It looked completely wrong. It looked like he was intentionally failing, just diving backward over the bar.
I mean, opposing coaches, when they saw this bizarre spectacle at the Olympics, they immediately demanded that the officials check the rule book.
They were sure there had to be some technicality, something that prohibited a back-first leap. But the flop was perfectly legal. It was just unfamiliar, and it violated the aesthetic sense of what proper high jumping was supposed to look like.
But the beauty of the flop, from a physics standpoint, is that it lets the athlete clear the bar while keeping their center of gravity lower than the bar itself. It's mechanically much more efficient than the straddle.
And Fosbury just keeps clearing heights. His success is irrefutable. Skepticism can't stop a successful jump.
He clears 2.24 meters, that's 7 feet, 4¼ inches, a new Olympic record. He wins the gold medal. And the old belief about the right way just collapsed right there in public.
Not because someone won an argument in a coaching clinic, but because someone performed a measurably better answer under the highest pressure imaginable.
The principle is so clear. When the environment, the tools, the rules, the available technology changes, your inherited beliefs about technique become suspect.
You have to rigorously separate what is simply common, the straddle, from what is actually correct, the flop, which was correct based on the new physics of the landing mat.
And progress often looks absurd. It can look embarrassing right up until the moment it becomes the new standard.
And this applies so far outside of sports. That safe approach in your industry, the way everyone structures a sales presentation or handles client onboarding, it might just be the approach with the most witnesses, not the one that actually delivers the best results today.
So the tool here is to regularly recheck the constraints in your field. What new software, what new market entrants, what new regulations have changed the entire playing field?
And second, you have to be willing to prototype ugly. Your first version of a radically different method is going to look ridiculous to outsiders, and it's going to feel awkward to you. So you have to build a private practice zone, low-stakes environment where looking wrong is not only allowed, it's encouraged.
Just like Fosbury spent 2 years perfecting the flop before he took it to the world stage.
Which brings us perfectly to our second athletic example. The redefinition of efficiency in basketball, all thanks to Stephen Curry.
Right. We're in 2016 now. It's an overtime game in Oklahoma City. And for decades, the orthodoxy in basketball was defined by proximity. Good shots were taken close to the basket.
A pull-up shot from well beyond 30 feet was universally considered reckless. It was high variance, it was. It was a foolish shot.
A coach would have been trained for decades to scream at a player for taking a shot that far out. It violates the basic mathematical assumption of low probability.
But Curry crosses half court, he sees the situation, And instead of running the clock down or passing to get a better position, he just pulls up from deep, deep range.
And it drops with 0.6 seconds left. It's the game winner.
That highlight is immortal because it fundamentally violated a core belief about what constitutes a good shot. Objectively, by the old rules, it was a bad shot. It was a low percentage attempt for 99.9% of the players in the history of the game.
But, and here's the analytical distinction, Curry's bad shot wasn't random. It was a strategically sound choice that was backed up by measurable, persistent evidence.
That season, he hit an NBA record 402 three-pointers. He became the first ever unanimous MVP. He had earned the range through practice and proof to redefine the very parameters of what was good.
To really get the analytical shift here, we have to look at expected value, or EV.
Right. A three-point shot is worth, obviously, 3 points. A mid-range shot is worth 2. If a player is extremely good, their percentage from 30 feet, while it's lower than a layup, might be high enough that the expected value, the percentage you make it times the points you get, still exceeds that of a tightly contested, heavily guarded two-point shot.
So for most players, that deep shot has an EV of, what, maybe 0.8 points per attempt?
For Curry, his unique ability makes that same shot's EV jump to maybe 1.1 points. He forced the entire league to retest a fundamental assumption. The old rule, that's a bad shot, became a new question.
Bad for whom? And under what assumptions about player capability and defensive positioning?
Exactly. The principle here is that a belief can be universally respected, written in all the coaching manuals, and still be analytically outdated. Curry redefined good using measurable outcomes and expected value, and that overrode decades of inherited but now irrelevant approval.
So the tool for you, for the listener, is to identify your coach voice. We all have one. It's that internal monologue that's always dictating self-restraint.
Write down the rule you hear in your head. Don't apply for that job. Don't publish that draft. Don't ask for that price. And then ask yourself, whose rule is this, really? And what era of my own capability was it built for? It's often just an echo of a risk-averse mentor or a past, less capable version of yourself.
And then you have to run a controlled heat check. Pick one professional bad shot, a bolder ask, a faster launch, a different marketing style, and take it 10 times in a low-stakes, measurable context.
And you can't track your anxiety or your feelings. You have to track the objective results. Your bad shot might just be bad advice left over from someone else's limits. And the only way to prove it is through measurable action.
Okay, we have established 4 really robust mechanisms for challenging our own certainty. We have the map for intuition, the conversation for identity, the outsider question for strategy, and performance metrics for inherited technique.
But every single one of these requires one final and frankly terrifying act for long-term survival. And that is public revision.
This brings us to Netflix in 2011, a company that's famous for continuous innovation, but which committed this massive pride-driven blunder.
They decided to adjust their strategy to focus entirely on the future, which is streaming. But they made a huge tactical mistake about the present. They split the pricing for their DVD by mail and their streaming bundles.
This decision immediately alienated their most loyal customers. It resulted in what was effectively a big price hike, and it led to an enormous customer backlash and significant churn.
And then that internal ego-driven belief kicks in. We can't show weakness. If we reverse course now, we'll look incompetent and vulnerable.
And that defensive pride led them straight into the escalation trap.
Instead of just apologizing and fixing the pricing, Netflix poured fuel on the fire. They announced they were splitting the DVD by mail service into a completely new, separate brand called Qwikster,
which created this administrative nightmare for the customer. 2 websites, 2 separate queues, 2 different bills. The company was prioritizing an internal strategic narrative. We have to separate these businesses for the future over the painful reality of their customer experience.
They completely missed the critical lesson. Customer sentiment is your retention rate. It is your reputation. The core belief that our long-term strategy must override short-term sentiment completely failed to acknowledge that the short-term sentiment was crushing their long-term trust.
And the market delivered a brutal, clear verdict. Their stock price dropped by over 75% in just a few months. The belief was proven, unequivocally, to be wrong.
Then came that incredibly uncomfortable moment of revision. The CEO, Reed Hastings, had to confront the mistake head-on.
And he did it with this famously blunt admission posted on the company blog in September of 2011. He just said, "I messed up. I owe you an explanation."
But the words alone weren't enough. A few weeks later came the ultimate operational act of revision. Netflix killed Qwikster, before it even fully launched.
They chose customer clarity keeping streaming and DVDs managed under one single account over protecting the leadership's strategic pride in their initial, flawed concept.
And that revision signaled something profound to the market and to their users. It signaled that Netflix was willing to change its mind in public based on evidence, the massive customer churn and feedback, the user outrage. They admitted they were wrong about what mattered most to the user, which was reducing friction.
The ultimate principle here is that a belief you can't revise will eventually humiliate you. Change has to be proactive.
The strongest leaders are not the ones who never change their minds. They're the ones who build the muscle of revision and who change before the market or reality completely breaks their position.
To make this operational in your own life, the tool is to institutionalize public, transparent revision. When you launch a project or start a new routine or announce a strategy, you should write a reversal clause beforehand.
Yes. For example, if X happens, if engagement drops by 20%, or if the cost savings don't materialize within 3 months, we will pause and we will revise.
It sets these clear, objective thresholds where your pride is forced to be quiet. You choose the metric that has to overrule your ego.
And most practically, you can use the powerful 2-sentence correction script that Hastings modeled. It has to be clean and transparent.
First sentence: I was wrong about the belief because the evidence.
Second sentence: here's the specific change we're making starting the date. You make the revision swift, clean, and without a lot of self-serving rationalization.
So your final action from this deep dive. Name one professional or personal belief that you feel you're currently defending out of pride. Maybe it's an old routine, a client you really should fire, or a commitment you never should have made.
Then choose one single metric that will overrule that pride. Cost reduced, clarity improved, stress minimized, trust rebuilt. And then make a clean, transparent revision today, using that 2-sentence script.
So we've taken this deep dive into 5 necessary paths for challenging our most deeply held certainties. We use the data map to defeat intuition with Jon Snow.
We use sustained dialogue to penetrate identity with Daryl Davis.
We use the outsider question to dismantle strategy with Andy Grove at Intel.
We use performance metrics to update technique with Fosbury and Curry.
And we use public revision to defeat pride with Netflix.
And in every single one of these cases, the central, painful, but ultimately freeing move was away from feeling. It was a move away from intuition, emotion, identity, and nostalgia.
And towards evidence, patterns, and testable hypotheses.
And as we close this out, let's return to that powerful historical context we started with. Our sources quote Florence Nightingale, a woman who dedicated her entire life to turning healthcare intuition into operational science, saying, "The study of statistics is thus a religious service."
Just think about that for a second. If data and patterns and mapping are the new religious service, the new source of truth and guidance that should govern your life, what old, unquestioned dogma in your personal life or your professional routine needs to be replaced?
What is your personal miasma belief? That vague, stinking fog you feel is just fate, but which is actually just unmapped context.
What inherited rule, what expensive certainty needs to be replaced by the cold, clear evidence of patterns and outcomes, just as Jon Snow replaced the certainty of bad air with the certainty of contaminated water?
That act of continuous, rigorous revision of treating your life not as a fixed story, but as a series of testable hypotheses, that is the work that ensures continuous growth.
We encourage you to start mapping that fog today.